The frozen shores of Bjornholm had seen blood before, but never like this. Astrid Ironsdottir stood over the mutilated remains of her father's torturer, her blade still dripping crimson onto the snow. For 3 years, the Ravenclaw clan had told her that Bjorn the Bold died honorably in battle. They lied. The truth carved into her father's bones told a different story, one of betrayal, agony, and a slow, deliberate death at the hands of men she'd called family. But Astrid wasn't just any Viking woman. Trained in secret by her father since childhood, she possessed skills that would make berserkers tremble. Tonight she would use every deadly technique he'd taught her. The clan that destroyed her bloodline was about to learn why Bjorn had hidden his daughter's true nature from the world. As screams echoed across the settlement and warriors fled in terror, one question burned in every survivor's mind: how many more would die before Astrid's thirst for vengeance was satisfied? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The discovery had come by accident, if the gods believed in such things. Astrid had been foraging for herbs in the sacred grove when she noticed the disturbed earth beneath the ancient oak. Something metallic glinted in the moonlight. Her father's arm ring, the one he'd worn since his first raid. But it wasn't supposed to be here. It was supposed to be lost at sea with his body. She dug with her bare hands until her fingers bled, uncovering fragments of bone that told a story more horrifying than any skald's tale. The marks were deliberate, methodical. Someone had taken their time with Bjorn the Bold, peeling away flesh and breaking bones with surgical precision. These weren't battle wounds. This was torture. The realization hit her like a berserker's axe to the chest. Her father hadn't died gloriously fighting Saxon raiders, as Jarl Magnus had claimed. He'd been murdered by his own people, tortured until his legendary strength finally broke. Astrid had always been different from other Norse women. While they learned to weave and tend fires, her father had taught her to read the language of violence written in blood spatter and blade angles. While they gossiped about potential marriages, she memorized the 17 ways to kill a man with her bare hands. Bjorn had seen something in his daughter that others missed, a darkness that matched his own, a hunger for justice that burned colder than winter storms. Now, as she stood in Ragnar the butcher's hut with his blood pooling at her feet, she understood why her father had kept her true nature hidden. The Ravenclaw clan feared strong women almost as much as they feared strong enemies. They'd killed her father not for his gold or his lands, but for his refusal to marry her off to Magnus's weak-chinned son. Ragnar had been the first to break under her questioning. It hadn't taken long. 3 precisely placed cuts with her sax, each one designed to cause maximum pain without risking death. He'd sobbed like a child as he confessed his role in her father's torture, how they'd kept him alive for days in the caves beneath the settlement, how Magnus himself had administered the final cuts that sent Bjorn to Valhalla. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very techniques her father had taught her to survive in a violent world were now serving his posthumous vengeance. Outside, chaos erupted through the settlement. Warriors stumbled from their homes, some still drunk on mead, others fumbling for weapons they'd never expected to need against one of their own. But Astrid wasn't one of their own anymore. She was something else entirely, a blade forged in betrayal and tempered by rage. She moved through the settlement like a shadow given substance. The training her father had drilled into her since childhood took over. Strike fast, strike silent, leave no witnesses who might warn the next target. 3 years of playing the grieving daughter had taught her patience. But tonight, patience was a luxury she could no longer afford. Eric, the swift, wasn't swift enough to avoid the throwing knife that found his throat as he rounded the corner of his dwelling. Olaf the Wise proved less than wise in his choice to charge her head-on, meeting his end on the point of her father's sword, the blade she'd retrieved from Ragnar's hut, where it had hung like a trophy. Each death was methodical, calculated. These weren't the wild swings of a berserker lost in battle fury. This was surgical precision, each killing stroke delivered with the cold efficiency of a master craftsman. Her father had taught her that rage was a tool, not a master. Tonight, she wielded that tool with devastating effect. The survivors who fled into the night would carry tales of the ghost-pale woman who moved like death itself, whose blade sang lullabies of vengeance in the darkness. They would warn other settlements, spread word of Astrid Ironsdottir's terrible awakening. But first, she had to finish what she'd started. Magnus still lived, still breathed, still believed himself safe in his great hall, surrounded by his remaining warriors. That arrogance would be his final mistake. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Astrid gripped the wooden practice sword with white knuckles. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, driving the blade through another sequence of strikes that Eric had drilled into her since dawn. "Again," Eric commanded, his weathered face showing no mercy. "Your enemies won't wait for you to catch your breath." 3 weeks had passed since her father's funeral, and Astrid had thrown herself into training with a ferocity that unsettled even the grizzled warrior. She moved like someone possessed, her slight frame belying the deadly precision developing in her movements. "I said again," Eric barked when she hesitated for a heartbeat. The wooden sword whistled through the air as Astrid executed a perfect downward strike, followed by a spinning parry that would have disarmed most opponents. Sweat dripped from her brow despite the morning chill, and her breath came in sharp puffs of vapor. "Better." Eric circled her like a predator, noting every flaw in her stance. "But anger makes you sloppy. Channel it, don't let it control you." "I'm not angry," Astrid lied through gritted teeth. Eric's bark of laughter held no humor. "Child, you burn with rage so bright I can feel the heat from here. Good. Rage can be sharpened into something useful, but only if you master it first." He lunged without warning, his practice blade aimed at her ribs. Astrid twisted away, bringing her sword up in a defensive arc that caught his weapon and redirected its momentum. The impact sent vibrations up her arms, but she held firm. "Why are you helping me?" she asked between ragged breaths. "The others think I'm cursed." Eric lowered his sword and studied her with eyes that had seen too many battles. "Because I knew your father before he became Jarl, before the responsibilities and politics changed him." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "And because I've seen what happens when promising warriors are dismissed too quickly." "What do you mean?" "Your father had many enemies, Astrid. Men who smiled to his face while sharpening knives for his back." Eric's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The night he died, I was meant to be on patrol near those cliffs." Astrid's blood turned cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone made sure I was called away on urgent business that turned out to be nothing more than a farmer's nightmare about wolves." His weathered hand tightened on his sword hilt. "By the time I realized the deception, it was too late." The practice sword slipped from Astrid's suddenly nerveless fingers. "You think someone killed him?" "I think your father discovered something that threatened powerful men, the same men who now whisper that his death was divine judgment for some imagined weakness." Eric's eyes blazed with suppressed fury. The same men who would see his daughter cast out as a reminder of their shame. Astrid's mind raced, connecting fragments she'd been too grief-stricken to piece together before, the hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, the way certain warriors avoided her gaze, the subtle but persistent suggestions that she should leave the settlement and start fresh elsewhere. "Who?" The word came out as a growl that would have impressed any wolf. "Patience." Eric retrieved her dropped sword and pressed it back into her hands. "First, you must become strong enough to survive what comes next. The men responsible won't hesitate to eliminate Gunnar's daughter if they perceive her as a threat. I want names. And I want to live long enough to see justice done." Eric's expression grew stern. "Trust must be earned gradually, even between allies. For now, know that your instincts about being unwelcome here are correct, but running away won't solve anything. Astrid raised the practice sword again, and Eric noted with approval how her grip had steadied. The trembling wasn't from exhaustion anymore. It was from barely contained violence seeking an outlet. What's the plan? We train, hard and in secret. I'll teach you everything I know about blade work, but that's only the beginning. Eric began moving through a complex series of forms, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next. You'll need to learn tracking, poisons, stealth, and how to read men's weaknesses like runes carved in stone. You're talking about assassination. I'm talking about survival. And eventually, when you're ready, I'm talking about justice. Eric's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Your father's enemies think his death ended their problems. They have no idea what storm they've unleashed. Astrid watched Eric's demonstration with hungry eyes, memorizing every detail. The helpless girl who'd wept over her father's grave was disappearing, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. When do we start learning the real weapons? Tomorrow night, after the others are asleep. Eric's expression grew solemn. Once we begin this path, there's no turning back, child. Are you certain this is what you want? Astrid's answer came without hesitation, her voice carrying a conviction that made the veteran warrior's blood run cold. I want to watch them burn. The frost-covered ground crunched beneath Astrid's boots as she made her way through the village before dawn. Most of Bjornstad still slumbered, but she knew where to find the one person who might speak truth about that cursed night 3 winters past. Gunnar the Lame sat by the dying embers of the blacksmith's forge, his twisted legs stretched before him, working leather by the orange glow. He looked up as her shadow fell across his workspace, his weathered face creasing into familiar lines of sorrow. "Little Raven," he murmured, using the name he'd called her since childhood. "You shouldn't be wandering alone in the dark." "I'm not little anymore, Gunnar." She settled beside him on the stone bench, noting how his hands trembled slightly as they worked. Age and guilt, she suspected, made poor companions. "And I think you know why I'm here." The old warrior's fingers stilled on the leather strapping. For long moments, only the whisper of wind through the forge filled the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets too long buried. "Your father was the finest man I ever knew, brave as a berserker, loyal as summer follows spring." Gunnar's eyes found hers in the dim light. That's why they had to destroy him. Astrid's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "They?" Harold's inner circle, the ones who feast at his high table now. Gunnar spat into the coals, making them hiss. "Your father discovered something. Gold missing from the tribute meant for the Danish kings, enough to buy ships, weapons, men's loyalty." The pieces began forming a picture in Astrid's mind, each revelation sharpening her focus like a blade on a whetstone. Harold was stealing from the tribute? Not just Harold, Eric the Red, Magnus Ironhand, Olaf Bloodaxe, all of them. They'd been skimming for months, planning something bigger than raids. Your father found their hidden cache in the old cave system, beyond the eastern ridge. Gunnar's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He was going to expose them at the next thing, so they killed him first. Made it look like bandits, even convinced some folk it was true. Gunnar's laugh held no humor. Bandits who knew exactly where to find him, who left his weapons and silver untouched, who killed with the precision of trained warriors. Astrid absorbed this, her mind already working through implications and possibilities. "You knew this and said nothing?" "I suspected. Couldn't prove it." Gunnar turned to face her fully. "And I was a coward. These aren't men you cross and live to tell about it. They rule through fear now, though most don't see it yet. But you're telling me now. Because you're not that scared little girl anymore. I see it in your eyes, the way you move. You've become something dangerous." He reached beneath his work table and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "Your father asked me to hold this in case something happened to him." With trembling fingers, Astrid unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay her father's warhammer, the one he'd carried since his first raid, and a small leather pouch. The hammer's familiar weight settled into her hands like a missing piece of her soul returning home. The pouch contained a detailed map marking locations throughout the fjord lands, with notes in her father's careful script. The evidence, Gunnar explained. Locations of hidden gold, records of stolen tribute, names of those involved. He was thorough, your father. Astrid studied the map by the forge light, memorizing every mark and notation. Her father had been planning something beyond simple exposure at the thing. These locations told a story of systematic theft spanning years, affecting multiple clans and kingdoms. There's more, Gunnar continued reluctantly. Harold's planning to move against Jarl Ragnar come spring, wants to unite the southern clans under his banner before the Danes notice their tribute running short. The stolen gold's been buying him allies, and if he succeeds, then the lies about your father become truth. Heroes get written by the victors, little Raven, and Harold's close to ensuring he'll be the one writing those stories. Astrid carefully rewrapped the map and secured it beneath her cloak alongside the hammer. The weight of both felt right, like destiny settling into place. How many others know the truth? A few. Most are too frightened to speak or too comfortable with Harold's generosity to care. Gunnar gripped her arm gently. Whatever you're planning, be careful. These men have power now, and they've killed to keep it. Rising to her feet, Astrid looked down at the old warrior who'd finally found courage enough to honor her father's memory. Thank you, Gunnar, for keeping faith. Your father saved my life twice in battle. It was long past time I returned the favor. He watched her move toward the forge entrance. Where will you go now? Astrid paused at the threshold, her breath visible in the cold air. To visit some old friends. It's time they learned what happens when you spill innocent blood. The darkness swallowed her figure as she disappeared into the pre-dawn shadows, leaving Gunnar alone with his hammers and the certain knowledge that Bjornstad would never be the same. The raven's caw pierced the morning mist as Astrid crouched behind the gnarled oak, watching Bjorn Ironside's homestead come alive with the day's activities. 3 days of careful observation had revealed the patterns she needed. The man who had driven the blade through her father's heart maintained a predictable routine, and predictability was a weakness she intended to exploit. Bjorn emerged from his longhouse as the sun crested the hills, his massive frame casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Even from a distance, Astrid could see the bear-claw necklace that had once belonged to her father swinging from his thick neck. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her sax, the blade her mother had given her before the fever took hold. Patience, she whispered to herself, the word forming a small cloud in the cold air. Patience yields the sweetest revenge. She had spent these 3 days learning more than just his schedule. Bjorn lived alone since his wife died in childbirth the previous winter, his nearest neighbor a half-day's ride through the dense forest. His thralls worked the outer fields while he tended to his prized stallions in the stable closest to the house. Most importantly, he kept a small shrine to Odin in a grove behind his dwelling, where he went each evening to make his offerings and boast of his victories to the All-Father. Today would mark his final boast. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Astrid moved like smoke through the forest, positioning herself among the sacred trees. The shrine was a simple affair, carved runestones arranged in a circle around a wooden idol with a fire pit where Bjorn burned his offerings. Old bloodstains darkened the altar stone where he sacrificed animals to curry favor with the gods. When Bjorn arrived at his customary time, Astrid was ready. She waited until he knelt before the idol, his back turned and his voice raised in prayer. The arrogance in his tone as he recounted his conquests made her blood sing with anticipation. When he spoke of her father, calling him weak, claiming Odin favored the stronger warrior, Astrid stepped from the shadows. The gods have interesting ways of testing such claims, she said, her voice cutting through his prayers like a blade through silk. Bjorn spun around, hand instinctively reaching for his sword, but froze when he saw her. Recognition dawned slowly in his eyes, followed by confusion, then cruel amusement. "The cripple's daughter," he laughed, rising to his full imposing height. "Come to avenge your broken father. You should have stayed hidden, little bird. Some battles are not meant for children to fight." "I agree," Astrid replied, stepping closer to the firelight. "That's why I spent 3 years learning to fight like a wolf instead." Bjorn's laughter died as he noticed how she moved, not with the awkward gait of the girl he remembered, but with fluid precision that spoke of deadly training. His hand found his sword hilt as she continued her approach. "Your father begged for mercy before I sent him to hell," he snarled, attempting to intimidate her with words since her demeanor had unsettled him. He wept like a woman, calling for his crippled daughter to save him. The lie was meant to break her spirit, but Astrid had learned to use pain as fuel. She smiled, a cold expression that made Bjorn take an involuntary step backward. "Thank you for confirming what I suspected," she said. "You're not just a murderer. You're a coward who needs lies to feel strong." Bjorn roared and drew his sword, the blade singing as it cleared its sheath. He brought it down in a devastating arc that would have cleaved most opponents in two. But Astrid wasn't there anymore. She had rolled to the side, her sacs opening a line across the back of his thigh as she moved. Blood darkened his leg wrappings as he spun to face her, his confidence shaken. The cut wasn't deep enough to cripple, but it announced her intentions clearly. This would not be a quick death. "Impossible," he breathed. "You're just a girl." "I was," Astrid agreed, circling him like a hunting cat. "Then you taught me what monsters look like. Thank you for the education." They fought among the sacred stones, his brute strength against her speed and cunning. Each time he thought he had her cornered, she slipped away, leaving another cut, another wound. She targeted tendons and muscles, slowly dismantling his ability to fight while avoiding his desperate swings. When he finally fell to his knees, weakened by blood loss and the realization that he had been outmatched by someone he'd dismissed, as helpless, Astrid stood before him with her blade at his throat. "Now," she said softly, "you're going to tell me exactly who else was involved in my father's murder." "And Bjorn?" She pressed the steel against his skin just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "This time, I suggest you tell the truth." The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud as Astrid crouched behind the weathered driftwood, watching Bjorn's longship cut through the dark waters. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady as stone. 3 days of tracking had led her here, to this narrow inlet where the coward thought himself safe. She had learned much in those days of shadow and silence. Bjorn the Bold, how the name tasted like ash in her mouth, had grown fat on his treachery. The silver arm rings that gleamed on his thick wrists, the fine cloak of bear fur draped across his shoulders, even the carved dragon head that crowned his ship's prow, all purchased with her father's blood. The ship's hull scraped against the rocky shore with a grinding whisper. 6 men leaped into the shallows, hauling the vessel onto the beach with practiced efficiency. Astrid counted them twice, memorizing each face, each weapon, each weakness her keen eyes could detect. The tall one favored his left leg. The bearded giant moved his right arm stiffly, an old wound poorly healed. The youngest kept glancing nervously at the tree line, his hand never straying far from his sax. Good. Fear would make them sloppy. Bjorn himself remained seated in the stern, barking orders like the petty king he imagined himself to be. The years had not been kind to him. Where once stood a warrior worthy of her father's friendship, now sat a bloated mockery of a man. His beard, streaked with premature grey, could not hide the weak chin beneath. His eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, had grown small and piggish in his fleshed face. "Secure the cargo," he commanded, his voice carrying across the water. "And be careful with those chests. That silver didn't come easy." Astrid's jaw clenched. She knew where that silver had come from. The same raids that had made her father enemies, the same treasure that had made Bjorn's betrayal profitable. How many pieces of silver had bought her father's location? How many had sealed his doom? The men began unloading wooden chests from the ship's belly, grunting under their weight. They would make camp here, she realized, noting how they moved with the familiarity of routine. This was their sanctuary, their secret haven, where they divided their stolen wealth far from prying eyes. Perfect. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the concealing mist, Astrid retreated deeper into the forest. She had seen enough to confirm what the merchant's whispered words had promised. Bjorn would be here for 3 days, just him and his most trusted men, counting coins and planning their next treachery. She made her way to the cave she had discovered the previous evening, a shallow cleft in the rock face that provided shelter and concealment. Her few possessions lay arranged with military precision: her father's sword, freshly sharpened to a razor's edge, the sacks she had claimed from a drunken warrior in Hedeby, strips of dried meat and hard bread that would sustain her, and most importantly, the small clay pots filled with ingredients that would serve her purpose. The merchant who had sold her the hemlock had thought her a lovesick girl seeking to poison an unfaithful lover. The fool who provided the nightshade believed her story about ridding her home of rats, if they only knew the rats she truly hunted. Working with careful precision, Astrid ground the herbs between 2 stones, measuring each portion with the knowledge she had gleaned from the Volva who once served her village. The old seeress had taught her many things during those long winter nights: which plants brought sleep, which brought death, and which brought something far more interesting: helplessness without unconsciousness. The powder that resulted from her work was colourless and nearly odourless. Mixed with ale, it would render a man weak as a newborn babe, while leaving his mind crystal clear to experience everything that followed. She had tested it on a village dog that had been marked for slaughter anyway. The results had been educational. As evening approached, painting the sky the colour of fresh blood, Astrid began her preparations. She bound her hair tightly against her skull and darkened her face with mud and charcoal. Her father's sword she secured across her back, while the sax found its familiar place at her hip. The poison she divided between 2 small bladders, fashioned from pig's intestines, tying them securely to her belt. Through the trees she could see the orange glow of the campfire Bjorn's men had kindled, the sound of their laughter carried on the evening breeze, rough voices boasting of past victories and future conquests. They felt safe here in their hidden cove, protected by the darkness and their own reputation for brutality. They had no idea that death walked among the trees, wearing the face of the girl whose father they had helped murder. Tonight, Bjorn the Bold would learn that some betrayals carried a price that could never be paid in silver. Tonight, the blood debt would begin to be settled. Astrid smiled in the gathering darkness, and it was not a pleasant sight. The fishing boat creaked against the wooden pier as Astrid stepped onto the dock, her boots silent despite the rotting planks beneath. Miklagard's harbour reeked of salt, fish, and unwashed bodies, 1,000 scents that would have overwhelmed her months ago. Now they were simply information: wind direction, tide patterns, the number of guards patrolling the waterfront. She pulled her hood lower and merged with the crowd of merchants and labourers. The great city sprawled before her like a wounded beast, its walls scarred by recent sieges, its streets thick with refugees from the northern wars. Perfect chaos to hide in. Bjorn's directions had been precise. The Varangian quarter lay beyond the bronze gates, where Norse warriors served the Byzantine emperor as his personal guard, where men who fled justice often found new names and new lives. Astrid's hand brushed the leather pouch at her hip, feeling the weight of the gold coins within. Blood money, taken from the men who had killed her father. She would need every piece for what came next. The bronze gates rose before her, flanked by guards in gleaming mail. Their axes bore the double-headed eagle of Byzantium, but their faces were familiar, the weathered features of men who had sailed from fjords not unlike her own. "State your business," one guard commanded in accented Greek. Astrid lifted her chin, letting her hood fall back. "I seek employment in the Varangian Guard. I bring steel and skill." The guards exchanged glances. One laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "The guard has no place for women, girl. Find yourself a husband instead." "Tell that to Olaf Grimson," Astrid said quietly. "Tell him a daughter of Ragnar Ironside comes calling." The laughter died. Both guards straightened, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. The name Ragnar Ironside still carried weight, even here in this distant city. "Wait here," the first guard muttered, disappearing through a smaller door beside the gate. Astrid waited, counting heartbeats, studying the fortifications. The walls were strong but not impregnable. 3 ways in, 2 ways out, guard rotations every quarter hour. She filed it all away. The guard returned with a third man, older, grey-bearded, wearing the rich furs of a commander. His eyes were the colour of winter ice, and when they fixed on Astrid, she saw recognition flicker there. "You have your father's look," he said in Norse, "but Ragnar's children are all dead. I heard it from reliable sources." "You heard wrong." Astrid stepped closer, letting him see the scar across her temple, the burn marks on her hands, though they tried their best to make it true. The commander studied her for a long moment. "Olaf Grimson died 3 years ago. Fever took him in the winter campaigns." Astrid felt the world tilt slightly. Another thread cut, another path closed. But she had not come this far to be deterred by death. "Then I'll speak to whoever leads the Norsemen now. I have questions that need answers and gold that needs spending." "Captain Thorvald might see you," the commander said slowly. "But the guard—" "I'm not here to join your guard." Astrid's voice carried the edge of sharpened steel. "I'm here to hire them." The commander's eyebrows rose. "For what purpose?" "Justice. The kind your emperor's laws can't provide." They led her through winding streets, lined with taverns and weapon shops, past buildings that mixed Norse timber construction with Byzantine stone. The Varangian Quarter was a piece of the homeland transplanted, complete with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of drinking songs. The hall where they brought her was smaller than her father's had been, but well appointed. Shields lined the walls, each bearing the arms of different clans. At the high table sat a man perhaps 40 years old, his blonde beard braided with silver wire. "Captain Thorvald," the commander announced. "This girl claims to be Ragnar Ironside's daughter." Thorvald looked up from his meal, amber eyes sharp with intelligence. "Ragnar's children died with him. The whole line was wiped out. So everyone keeps telling me." Astrid stepped forward and drew her sax, laying it on the table. The blade caught the firelight, revealing the wolf's head pommel, Ragnar's mark, known to any who had served with him. "My father forged this blade. He gave it to me on my 16th winter, 3 days before Magnus Bloodaxe's men came in the night." She met Thorvald's gaze steadily. "I survived. I learned. And now I've come to collect what's owed." Thorvald picked up the sax, testing its balance, examining the intricate metalwork. When he looked up again, his expression had changed. "What do you want from us, daughter of Ragnar?" Astrid smiled, and several men shifted uncomfortably. There was nothing warm in that expression, only the cold promise of violence to come. "I want to hire the best killers in Miklagard," she said, "because I have a war to finish." The first test came 3 days after Eric's burial. Astrid knelt by the frozen stream, washing blood from her hands as steam rose from the crimson water. Behind her, what remained of Bjorn the Cruel lay scattered across the snow like broken kindling. He had been her father's lieutenant once, before gold and cowardice turned his heart black. She had found him exactly where Rune said she would, in the brothel at Hedeby, drunk on mead and boasting about how he'd helped Jarl Magnus plan her father's downfall. The whores had scattered when she entered, recognizing death in her pale eyes. Bjorn had laughed at first, seeing only a slip of a girl with braided hair and travel-worn clothes. He wasn't laughing when she finished. The kill had been neither clean nor quick. She wanted him to understand, to feel the same helplessness her father had experienced in those final moments. When Bjorn begged, and he did beg in the end, she whispered her father's name before opening his throat. Now, as she cleaned her father's sword in the icy water, Astrid felt the first stirrings of something she barely recognized. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of rightness, of balance being restored to a world that had tilted too far toward injustice. "One down," she murmured to the wind. 19 to go. The journey north took her through territories she'd never seen, lands where her father's name still carried weight among the older warriors. She moved like a ghost through trading posts and settlements, gathering information, testing her skills against any fool brave enough to challenge a lone woman on the road. Word of Bjorn's death spread faster than wildfire. The stories grew with each telling, how she'd carved ancient runes into his flesh before killing him, how his screams had shattered windows 3 streets away, how she'd drunk his blood from a cup made of his own skull. None of it was true, but Astrid didn't correct the tales. Fear was another weapon, and she was learning to wield them all. At a tavern in Jelling, she overheard 2 merchants discussing Jarl Magnus's recent acquisitions. New ships, new men, new alliances forged with southern lords who cared nothing for honor. Her father's death had indeed been profitable for those who orchestrated it. "They say he's planning something big," the younger merchant whispered over his ale. "A raid on the Frankish coast, maybe, or an attack on one of his rivals." "Smart man, that Magnus," his companion replied. "Knows how to eliminate obstacles." Astrid's hand found the hilt of her sax, the curved blade her mother had given her years ago. It would be so easy to silence them both, to add their blood to her growing tally. But these were small men, insignificant. Her true prey required patience. She left the tavern and found lodging at a nearby farmstead, where the elderly owner recognized something familiar in her bearing. "You're Eric Blood Eagle's daughter," he said simply. It wasn't a question. "I am." The old warrior, for she could see that's what he had been, despite his stooped shoulders and grey beard, studied her with knowing eyes. "I fought beside your father at Stamford Bridge. Good man. Heard what happened to him. Did you hear who was responsible?" He nodded slowly. "Aye. Also heard someone's been settling accounts, starting with that snake Bjorn." Astrid said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "Your father saved my life once," the old man continued. "Took an arrow meant for me. If there's anything you need, information, supplies, a place to rest, you need only ask." That night he told her stories of her father's youth, of battles fought and victories won when honor still meant something, but more importantly, he shared intelligence about Magnus's inner circle, about their habits and weaknesses, about the best times and places to find them alone. When she left the next morning, her pack was heavier with supplies and her mind sharper with purpose. The old warrior pressed a small wooden token into her hand, a carved wolf's head. "Show this to Torvin One Eye in Rebe," he said. "Tell him Gunnar sends word. He'll help you." The network was revealing itself, she realized. Her father's old companions, scattered across the lands, but still bound by oaths of loyalty. They couldn't act openly against Magnus. He was too powerful, too well connected, but they could aid his daughter in her quest for vengeance. As winter deepened and the nights grew longer, Astrid continued her hunt. Each kill taught her something new about herself, about the capacity for violence that lay coiled in her heart like a sleeping serpent. She was becoming something her father had never been, not just a warrior, but a weapon forged in grief and tempered by rage. The scared girl who had wept over Eric's grave was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. Magnus and his conspirators had created their own destruction when they chose to betray Eric Blood Eagle. They would learn that some daughters inherit more than just their father's names. The screams echoing from Jarl Ericsson's longhouse had ceased 3 hours ago, but the silence that followed proved far more unsettling. Astrid emerged from the ornate doors, her leather armor still pristine despite the carnage she'd left behind. Blood decorated her hands like war paint, and her father's axe gleamed wetly in the flickering torchlight. Word of her nocturnal visit would spread by dawn, but she needed the remaining conspirators to hear whispers first, to let fear ferment in their bellies before she arrived at their doors. Terror was a weapon sharper than any blade when wielded properly. She made her way through the sleeping settlement, her footsteps deliberate and unhurried. The next name on her father's list lived in a modest dwelling near the harbour, where the salt air mixed with the metallic scent that now seemed to follow her everywhere. Gunnar the shipwright had always seemed harmless enough, building vessels for traders and raiders alike, but his signature on that damning parchment told a different story. The door to Gunnar's home stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling onto the worn wooden steps. Astrid paused, sensing something amiss. She'd expected to find him cowering in his bed or perhaps attempting to flee under cover of darkness. Instead, she heard the low murmur of voices from within. She pressed herself against the rough timber wall and listened. 3 distinct voices carried through the thin walls. Gunnar's nervous tenor, another man's gruff baritone, and a woman's sharp whisper that made Astrid's blood freeze. She recognized that voice. Helga the Wise, the settlement's vulva and spiritual advisor, whose counsel was sought by chieftains across the fjords. The girl moves like death incarnate, Helga was saying. I watched her enter Ericsson's hall. She didn't emerge the same person. Sorcery, Gunnar spat. Has to be. No natural woman could do what she's done. Natural or not, the third voice interjected. She's coming for us. We should have killed her years ago when we had the chance. Astrid's grip tightened on her axe handle. The third conspirator's identity would have to wait. She kicked open the door with such force that it splintered against the interior wall. The 3 figures seated around the simple wooden table turned toward her in synchronized terror. Gunnar knocked over his ale horn in his haste to stand, the dark liquid spreading across the scarred tabletop like a portent. Helga remained motionless, her weathered hands folded before her, while the third man, Astrid recognized him now as Bjorn Ironside, one of her father's former shield brothers, reached for the sword at his hip. I wouldn't, Astrid said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd already won. You'll only die tired. Bjorn's hand froze halfway to his weapon. Astrid, child, you don't understand the forces at play here. Your father was murdered by cowards who smiled at his table while sharpening their knives. She stepped into the room, noting how each of them shrank back despite outnumbering her 3-1. I understand perfectly. Helga finally spoke, her voice carrying the mystical cadence she used during ceremonies. The threads of fate cannot be cut so easily, young one. What you seek will bring only darkness upon yourself. Darkness? Astrid laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. I've been living in darkness for 5 years, wondering why my father's death felt wrong, why his closest allies abandoned me so quickly after the funeral pyre burned out. You want to speak of fate? My father trusted you, Helga. He came to you for guidance before every important decision. Did you guide him to his death? The vulva's composure cracked slightly. Some deaths are necessary for the greater good. Whose greater good? Astrid raised her axe, its edge catching the lamplight. Yours? The Danes who paid you? Or perhaps someone else entirely? Gunnar made a desperate lunge for the door, but Astrid moved with fluid precision. Her father's axe found his spine before he'd taken 3 steps, dropping him to the floor in a heap of twitching limbs. She turned back to the remaining conspirators without a glance at the dying man. Now then, she said conversationally, let's discuss the finer details of my father's murder, starting with who gave the orders. Bjorn drew his sword with shaking hands. You've become something unnatural, girl. Whatever humanity you once possessed is gone. Good, Astrid replied. Humanity was a luxury I couldn't afford. She feinted left, then pivoted right, her axe cleaving through Bjorn's guard and opening his throat in one smooth motion. He collapsed beside Gunnar, his lifeblood mixing with the spilled ale. Helga watched these deaths with eerie calm, as if observing a ritual sacrifice she'd orchestrated herself. You think this will bring you peace? Peace? Astrid cleaned her axe blade on Bjorn's cloak. I'm not seeking peace, old woman. I'm seeking justice, and you're going to help me find the person who orchestrated my father's death, or you'll join your friends in Hell's domain. The vulva smiled then, expression both knowing and terrible. "Very well, child of vengeance, but know this, the truth you seek will demand a price even you may not be willing to pay." The screams from the longhouse had stopped an hour ago, but the smell of blood still hung thick in the morning air. Astrid stood in the doorway, her leather armor splattered crimson, watching as the last of Jarl Thorvald's men stumbled away into the mist, those who could still walk anyway. She had left Thorvald himself for last, bound to the same oak post where they had displayed her father's head 3 years ago. The irony was not lost on her, though she doubted the whimpering man before her possessed the wit to appreciate it. "Please," he gasped through broken teeth, "I have gold, ships, whatever you want." Astrid cleaned her sacks methodically, the curved blade gleaming as she worked. "What I wanted was my father alive. What I wanted was my family's honor intact. What I wanted was justice." She looked up, her pale eyes catching the firelight like winter ice. "Since I cannot have those things, I will settle for your suffering." The confession had come easily enough once she had started removing his fingers. How they had poisoned Harold's ale before the duel. How they had spread lies about his cowardice to justify the execution. How they had divided his lands among themselves like carrion birds picking at a corpse. "Your father was weak," Thorvald spat, trying to summon defiance even as blood ran down his chin. "He deserved to die." The words hung in the air between them. Astrid felt something cold and final settle in her chest, like the moment when lake ice forms thick enough to walk on. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but you deserve to die more." The blade found the soft space beneath his ribs with surgical precision. She had learned anatomy well during her exile, studying the bodies of those foolish enough to hunt her. Every nerve, every vessel, every way to cause maximum pain while prolonging life. Thorvald's eyes went wide, then glassy. The last of her father's murderers joined his companions in death. Astrid wiped her hands on his cloak and walked outside. The village lay before her in the pre-dawn gloom, smoke rising from chimneys where families huddled around their hearths. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the blood-soaked drama that had consumed her existence. She should feel satisfaction, victory, the completion of a sacred oath. Instead, she felt hollow. "It's done then." The voice came from behind her. Astrid didn't turn, recognizing the gruff tone of Bjorn One Eye, the old warrior who had taught her to fight during her exile. He emerged from the shadows like a ghost, his weathered face grim. "The last of them," she confirmed. "My father's honor is restored. And what now, Blood Raven? What does the most feared killer in the Northlands do when there are no more enemies to slay?" The question cut deeper than any blade. She had spent 3 years living for this moment, shaped herself into an instrument of vengeance so sharp she could split souls. But now, with her quest complete, what remained? "There are always enemies," she said, though the words felt hollow. Bjorn stepped beside her, studying her face in the flickering torchlight. "Aye, but none that belong to you. These were your father's enemies, girl, your inheritance of pain. But they're gone now, and you're still breathing." In the distance, a horn sounded across the water, ships flying the banner of King Magnus. Word of her campaign had reached the royal court, as she had known it would. A woman who could single-handedly destroy 3 Jarls and their warbands was either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat. "They're coming for you," Bjorn observed. "Let them come." Astrid's hand rested on her sword hilt, muscle memory from countless battles. "I am not the frightened girl they exiled." "No," the old warrior agreed. "You're something far more dangerous. Question is, what will you do with all that rage now that it has no proper target?" The ships drew closer, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning fog. Astrid could make out the glint of mail, the forest of spears. An army, come to claim her or kill her. She thought of her father, gentle Harold, who had never raised his voice, who had told her stories by the fire and taught her that honor mattered more than gold. He would not recognize the creature she had become in his name. The thought should have brought shame. Instead, it brought clarity. "Magnus wants to meet the Blood Raven," she said, watching the approaching vessels. "Very well, but he will find that some birds cannot be caged." She turned from Thorvald's corpse and walked toward the shore, her boots crunching on frost-covered stones. Behind her lay the wreckage of her old life, the bodies of her enemies, the ashes of her father's shame. Ahead lay something new entirely. The screams echoed across the fjord as Astrid's longship emerged from the morning mist like a harbinger of doom. Her black sails bore the mark she had carved into every survivor's forehead, a twisted rune that meant dishonor. The coastal village of Ravenclaw had nowhere to run. Astrid stood at the prow, her father's reforged blade gleaming in the pale sunlight. The weapon had tasted the blood of 12 men already. Each one present the night Magnus Ironborn was betrayed. But today's target was different. Today she would claim Bjorn the Cruel, the man who had driven the spear through her father's heart while he lay wounded and defenseless. "Remember," she called to her crew without turning around, "Bjorn dies by my hand alone. The others are yours." Her warriors, outcasts and oathbreakers all, pounded their shields in acknowledgement. She had gathered them from the forgotten corners of the Norselands, men and women who understood betrayal as intimately as she did. They followed her not for gold or glory, but for the promise of righteous vengeance. The village bells began to ring as sentries spotted the approaching vessel. Astrid smiled coldly. Let them ring. Let Bjorn know death was coming for him. The longship's hull scraped against the rocky shore with a sound like grinding bones. Astrid leaped onto the beach, her boots splashing through the shallows as her crew swarmed behind her. The first defenders met them at the tree line, young men with fear in their eyes and trembling hands on their weapons. Astrid cut through them like wheat before the scythe. Her blade sang as it carved through mail and flesh, each strike precise and merciless. She had learned much in the months since her transformation began, studying under the tutelage of Grimhild the sorceress and sparring with the legendary warrior poet Sigurd Flamehair. Every lesson had been paid for in blood and pain, forging her into something harder than iron. A massive warrior charged her with a two-handed axe, roaring his defiance. Astrid sidestepped the clumsy attack and opened his throat with a backhand slash, never breaking stride. Behind her, the sounds of battle grew. Metal against metal, the wet thud of blades finding flesh, the desperate cries of the dying. She found Bjorn in the great hall, seated on his carved chair as if receiving guests. He was older than she remembered, his once golden beard now streaked with grey, but his eyes still held the same cruel intelligence that had helped orchestrate her father's doom. "Little Astrid," he said, rising slowly, "I wondered when you would come. The stories have been entertaining." "Have they?" Astrid circled him like a wolf stalking prey. "Tell me, do they mention how you begged when I took your brother's eyes? How he wept like a child?" Bjorn's jaw tightened. Olaf always was weak, as was your father. The insult hung in the air between them. Astrid felt the familiar cold fury settle over her, that icy calm that had become her closest companion. "Draw your blade." "With pleasure." Bjorn pulled free a massive sword, its edge gleaming with fresh oil. "Your father died squealing. You'll do the same." They came together in a crash of steel that echoed through the hall. Bjorn was strong, his years of experience evident in every calculated strike. But Astrid was faster, her smaller frame allowing her to slip past his guard again and again. She opened a line across his ribs, then another along his sword arm. "You're bleeding, old man," she taunted, dancing back from his increasingly wild swings. "Still enough left to gut a treacherous bitch," Bjorn snarled, launching a fierce combination that drove her back toward the fire pit. Astrid let him think he was winning, drawing him deeper into the trap. When he overextended on a powerful overhead strike, she rolled aside and came up behind him. Her blade found the gap between his shoulder plates, sliding deep into muscle and sinew. Bjorn dropped his sword with a cry of pain. Astrid kicked it away, then grabbed him by the hair and forced him to his knees before the high table where he had once feasted with her father as an honored guest. "Look at me," she commanded, pressing her blade to his throat. "I want you to see your death coming." The great doors burst open as her warriors finished their work outside. They dragged in the surviving villagers, women and children, mostly the old and infirm. None of them would be harmed. Astrid's war was with specific men, not innocents. "Let them watch," she ordered. "Let them see what happens to oathbreakers." Bjorn tried to speak, perhaps to beg or bargain, but Astrid's blade silenced him forever. His blood painted the ancient stones as she held his lifeless head high for all to see. The message would spread, as it always did. Astrid Bloodbane had claimed another name from her list. Soon, very soon, she would face the last and greatest of her father's betrayers. Jarl Gunnar Ravensblood was waiting. The sea spray stung Astrid's face as her longship cut through the dark waters toward Bjorn's stronghold. Behind her, 3 more vessels followed in formation, their hulls painted black to blend with the night. Each ship carried 30 of her most ruthless warriors, men and women who had sworn blood oaths to see her father's murderers destroyed. She had spent weeks gathering intelligence on Bjorn Ironside's fortress. The Jarl who had orchestrated Magnus's death believed himself untouchable behind his wooden palisades and stone towers. His arrogance would be his downfall. "The guards change at midnight," whispered Ulf, her scarred lieutenant, who knelt beside her at the prow. "Just as your spy promised." Astrid nodded, her fingers tracing the pommel of her father's sword. The blade thirsted for Bjorn's blood, and tonight it would drink its fill. She had already crossed 2 names from her list of vengeance. 5 remained, but Bjorn was the architect of the conspiracy. His death would send shockwaves through the Norse lands. The ships glided silently into a hidden cove beneath towering cliffs. Astrid's warriors moved like shadows, securing their vessels and checking their weapons. No words were spoken. Every man and woman knew their role in the symphony of death she had composed. She led the first group up the treacherous cliff face, her fingers finding purchase on wet stone as rain began to fall. The storm she had prayed for was arriving right on schedule, muffling their approach and driving the sentries to seek shelter. The gods themselves seemed to favor her quest for justice. At the cliff's edge, she peered across the moonlit compound. Bjorn's great hall dominated the center, surrounded by smaller buildings and training yards. Torches flickered in the wind, casting dancing shadows that would conceal her warriors' movements. She counted the guards, noting their positions exactly as her informant had described. Astrid raised her hand, and her warriors spread out like wolves surrounding prey. She had learned patience from her years as an outcast, watching and waiting until the perfect moment to strike. That moment was now. The first sentry died without a sound, Ulf's blade sliding between his ribs as silent as a prayer. One by one, the outer guards fell to her warrior's steel. No alarms rang out, no horns sounded warning. The fortress slept, unaware that death walked among them. She approached the great hall's entrance where 2 guards stood beneath the overhanging roof. Through the gaps in the wooden walls she could hear laughter and the clinking of ale cups. Bjorn was hosting a feast, celebrating some petty victory while her father's bones lay cold in his grave. The guards never saw her coming. Her sax opened the first one's throat while her knee drove into the second's stomach, doubling him over so she could drive her blade down through his neck. Both bodies crumpled silently to the mud. Inside the hall, warmth and light spilled from the central fire pit. Bjorn sat at the high table, a massive man with graying braids and arms thick as tree trunks. He was regaling his warriors with some boastful tale, his voice booming over the crackling flames. At his side sat his eldest son, a cruel-faced youth who had inherited his father's arrogance but none of his cunning. Astrid waited in the shadows by the door until her warriors had surrounded the building. Then she stepped into the light, her father's sword gleaming in her hand like a fragment of captured starlight. The laughter died instantly. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Every eye in the hall turned toward the young woman who had materialized from the darkness like an avenging spirit. "Bjorn Ironside," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I am Astrid, daughter of Magnus the Bold. You murdered my father, and now I have come to collect the blood debt." Bjorn's face went pale, then flushed red with rage. He lurched to his feet, his hand reaching for his weapon. Impossible. Magnus had no daughter. His line died with him. "You are wrong about many things," Astrid replied, advancing slowly down the center of the hall. Warriors on both sides began reaching for their swords, but none dared move first. You thought him weak because he showed mercy. You thought his allies would abandon him. You thought his death would go unavenged. The hall erupted into chaos as steel rang against steel. But Astrid's eyes remained fixed on Bjorn as she cut through his men like wheat before the scythe. Every lesson her father had taught her, every skill she had honed in exile, every ounce of rage she had harbored, all of it flowed through her sword arm as she carved a path toward her target. Bjorn met her charge with a massive war axe, the impact of their clash sending sparks flying. He was strong, experienced, and desperate. But Astrid was something far more dangerous. She was justice given form, and she would not be denied. The screams echoing from Bjorn's longhouse had drawn half the village by dawn. Astrid stood in the doorway, blood splattered across her leather armor, watching as the gathered crowd processed what lay within. Bjorn the Bold, who had orchestrated her father's murder, hung suspended from the rafters by chains of his own making, the same chains he'd used to bind prisoners for his twisted entertainment, but death had been too merciful for him to find quickly. "By the gods," whispered Helga, the village's eldest woman, as she peered past Astrid into the carnage. What manner of beast could do this? Astrid's lips curved into something that barely resembled a smile. "The same beast you all created when you let him murder my father for his silver." The crowd shifted uneasily. They'd known this day would come, had felt it building like storm clouds on the horizon ever since Astrid had returned from her exile in the northern wastes. Word of her bloody vengeance had preceded her, how she'd tracked down Eric Bloodaxe and left him to die slowly in a bear trap, how she'd fed Magnus the Cruel to his own warhounds piece by piece. But seeing it firsthand was different. The methodical precision of Bjorn's destruction spoke of something beyond mere revenge. This was artistry painted in agony. "Where is Gunnar?" Astrid's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The crowd parted instinctively, and she could see the fear in their eyes. Good. Fear would make the rest of this easier. He sailed north 3 days ago," stammered Olaf the merchant, the same man who'd bought stolen goods from her father's killers. "Heard you were coming and fled like the coward he is." Astrid nodded slowly. Gunnar Ironside was the last of the 3 men who'd murdered her father, and perhaps the most cunning. He'd known she was working her way through the list and had run rather than face her justice, but there was nowhere in Midgard he could hide that she wouldn't find him. And his family? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone knew Gunnar had a wife and 2 young sons. Everyone also knew what Astrid was capable of when crossed. "Please," Olaf's voice cracked. "His children are innocent. Were my father's hands innocent when they worked his forge, making weapons to protect this ungrateful village?" Astrid's voice rose to a roar that sent several people stumbling backward. "Was his blood innocent when it soaked into the earth while you all counted your silver?" She stepped fully out of Bjorn's longhouse, and the crowd could see the full extent of the carnage she wore. Not just blood, but something else, a darkness that seemed to emanate from her very skin, as if the gods themselves had marked her as an instrument of their wrath. "I made a promise to my father's spirit," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than her shouts. "Every man who participated in his murder would die slowly. Every man who profited from it would lose everything. Every man who stayed silent would learn the true meaning of regret." The crowd was thinning now, people backing away and fleeing to their homes, But Astrid wasn't finished with them. "You think this ends with Gunnar's death?" She laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "This village bred the corruption that killed my father. This village chose silver over honor, comfort over justice. You're all complicit." Helga, who'd known Astrid since birth, stepped forward with shaking hands. "Child, please, we know we failed you, failed him, but this isn't the way." "There is no other way." Astrid's roar shook the very timbers of the nearby houses. "You had your chance for justice when my father lay dying. You chose to look away. Now you'll live with the consequences of that choice." She turned to face the fjord, where her own longship waited, its black sail emblazoned with the symbol she'd carved into each of her victims, a twisted tree representing the family line that had been cut short by greed and cowardice. "When Gunnar returns, and he will return, because men like him always think they're clever enough to reclaim what they've lost, send him this message. I'll be waiting in the place where my father died. Let him come armed. Let him bring whatever allies he can muster. It won't matter." She paused at the edge of the village, looking back one final time at the place that had once been her home. "And when you tell stories of what happened here, when you whisper my name to frighten your children into obedience, remember this: I was made by your choices. Every scream that echoes in your nightmares exists because you lacked the courage to stand for what was right." The black sail caught the morning wind, carrying Astrid toward her final confrontation. The great hall of Jarl Magnus fell silent as Astrid stepped through the shattered doorway, her boots crunching on splinters of oak that had once been an impenetrable barrier. Blood dripped steadily from her axe blade, leaving a crimson trail across the stone floor. Behind her, the screams of dying warriors echoed through the corridors she had carved through his stronghold. Magnus sat slumped in his high seat, his face ashen beneath his greying beard. The mighty Jarl who had once commanded 300 warriors now clutched a horn of ale with trembling hands, watching as death incarnate approached him with measured steps. His remaining guards had fled or fallen, leaving him alone to face the reckoning he had tried so desperately to avoid. "You look smaller than I remembered," Astrid said, her voice carrying the cold indifference of winter wind. "When I was a child, you seemed like a giant. Now I see you for what you truly are, a coward hiding behind other men's courage." Magnus attempted to summon his old authority. "You dare enter my hall with blood on your hands. I'm still Jarl here, girl. I still command." "You command nothing." Astrid's words cut through his bluster like her blade through flesh. "Your warriors lie dead. Your allies have abandoned you. Your gold cannot buy you another heartbeat beyond what I choose to grant you." The Jarl's facade cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath. "What do you want? Gold? Ships? Name your price, and we can end this madness." Astrid laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or mercy. "There is no price for what you took from me. There is no gold that can purchase my father's life, no treasure that can restore the years you stole from our family. But I will take something from you that you value more than silver or ships." She moved closer, and Magnus pressed himself back into his chair, suddenly understanding that no bargain would save him. The weight of his past crimes settled on his shoulders like stones, dragging him toward the depths of Niflheim. "Your son fought well," Astrid continued conversationally, cleaning her axe blade with deliberate precision. "Better than I expected from Bjorn's spawn. He died with more honor than his father possessed in life." Magnus's face contorted with anguish. "Bjorn? You killed my boy?" "He came at me with 17 men, thinking to claim glory by ending the daughter of Eric Ironhand. I sent him to the halls of the dead with his sword in his hand, a mercy you never showed my father." The Jarl's composure shattered completely. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he realized the full scope of his loss. "He was all I had left. My heir, my legacy. Your legacy is written in treachery and innocent blood. Tonight it ends." Magnus suddenly lunged for the sword that hung on the wall behind his throne, desperation giving him speed. But Astrid had anticipated this final gambit. Her throwing knife took him through the wrist, pinning his hand to the wooden beam. He screamed as his fingers spasmed, unable to grasp the weapon that might have given him an honorable death. "No," Astrid said firmly. "You will not die with blade in hand. You will not feast in Valhalla with the warriors you betrayed. Your death will be as craven as your life." She produced a length of rope from her belt, its purpose unmistakable. Magnus's eyes widened with horror as he understood her intention. In Norse culture, death by hanging was reserved for the most despicable criminals, thralls, oath-breakers, and cowards. Such a death barred the soul from Valhalla forever, condemning it to wander the misty realms of dishonor. "Please," Magnus whispered, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "I have gold hidden in the mountains, enough to buy your own kingdom. I can tell you where—" "I already found your treasure," Astrid replied, fashioning a noose with practiced efficiency. "It will help rebuild what you destroyed. Your stolen wealth will feed the families of men you murdered, shelter the children you made orphans." She dragged him from his chair with surprising strength, ignoring his pleas and struggles. The great Jarl, who had once been feared across 3 fjords, now whimpered like a beaten dog as she secured the rope to the great beam that supported his hall. "Tell me one thing before you meet your fate," she said, positioning the noose around his neck. "Was it worth it? The silver my uncle paid you to betray my father, did it bring you happiness in your final years?" Magnus could only sob, his courage finally spent. The weight of his crimes had broken him more thoroughly than any torture could have accomplished. Astrid stepped back, her task nearly complete. "When men speak of this night, they will remember that justice came for you at last, that Eric Ironhand's daughter repaid every debt in full." With that, she released the rope. The blood of her enemies still steamed in the morning frost as Astrid stood atop the ramparts of Bjornholm, watching the last of Jarl Ragnar's men flee across the frozen fjord. Their screams echoed off the mountain walls, a symphony she had orchestrated with surgical precision. 3 days of siege had ended not with surrender, but with complete annihilation of those who had conspired against her father. Below in the great hall, the surviving nobles knelt in chains, their proud faces now masks of terror. These were the men who had whispered poison in King Magnus's ear, who had convinced him that Thorvald the Bold posed a threat to the crown. They had orchestrated her father's execution under false charges of treason, never imagining his outcast daughter would return to claim vengeance. Astrid descended the stone steps, her wolf-hide cloak dragging behind her like a shadow. The berserker's crown, her father's crown, sat heavy upon her brow, its iron teeth still stained with Ragnar's blood. Each step echoed through the hall, and the prisoners shrank back as if death itself approached. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Earl Gunnar raised his trembling head, the same man who had stood at Magnus's side when the execution order was signed, now cowered like a beaten dog. "Astrid, we can negotiate. Gold, land, whatever you—" Her sword whispered from its sheath, the point coming to rest beneath his chin. "Did my father have opportunity to negotiate when you led him to the executioner's block?" "We had no choice." Gunnar's words tumbled out in desperation. Magnus suspected treachery everywhere. "We told him what he wanted to hear to save our own necks. And in doing so, you condemned the most loyal man in the kingdom." Astrid's grip tightened on the sword hilt. "My father died believing his king had judged him justly, never knowing his trusted friends had betrayed him." Through the hall's great doors, her lieutenants entered dragging more prisoners, the merchants who had profited from seized lands, the priests who had blessed the execution, the scribes who had forged evidence. Her network of spies, cultivated over 3 years of careful planning, had delivered them all. Eric the Crow, her spymaster, approached with a leather satchel. "The last of them, my lady. We found them hiding in the monastery cellars." Among the new prisoners was Father Olaf, the priest who had given last rites to her father. His holy robes were torn and muddy, his face pale with fear. When their eyes met, recognition sparked in his features. "I remember you," he whispered, "the girl who threw herself on her father's body. I thought you had died of grief." "Grief would have been merciful," Astrid replied. Instead, I lived, I learned, I planned. She gestured to the carnage visible through the windows. And now I harvest what you all sowed. The priest's voice shook. Your father, he spoke of you at the end. He said you had the strength to build rather than destroy. This is not what he would have wanted. For a moment, something flickered across Astrid's face, a shadow of the girl she had once been, but it vanished like smoke. My father was naive. He believed in honor among thieves, loyalty among cowards. His mercy earned him nothing but a traitor's death. She turned to address all the prisoners, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. You will not die quickly like him. Each of you will experience the terror he felt, the betrayal, the slow realization that death comes not from enemies, but from those you trusted. The great doors opened again, and Magnus himself was dragged in, his royal garments stripped away, his hands bound with the same rope that had bound her father. The once mighty king looked ancient now, his beard white with fear, his eyes darting desperately around the hall. Astrid, Magnus gasped, falling to his knees. I was wrong. I see that now. Your father was innocent. I was mad with paranoia, seeing threats where none existed. But this makes you no better than me. She crouched before him, close enough that he could see his reflection in her cold eyes. You're wrong, Magnus. I am far worse than you ever were. Your paranoia was weakness. My vengeance is strength. Rising, she addressed her gathered warriors. Bind them in the cells below. Each will face judgment according to their crimes. Some will feed the ravens. Others will serve as examples of what happens to oath-breakers. As her men dragged the prisoners away, Astrid remained alone in the great hall. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight. Somewhere in that quiet, she thought she heard an echo of her father's voice, speaking of mercy and honor. She closed her eyes, remembering his final words to her, "Do not let hatred consume what love built." When she opened them again, her expression had hardened to stone. Love had built nothing but graves. Only hatred had the strength to tear down kingdoms. The great hall of Jarl Eriksson fell silent as Astrid's blade found its mark between his ribs. His eyes widened in disbelief, blood frothing at his lips as he looked down at the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a mad exile's daughter. The assembled warriors who moments before had been cheering their lord's anticipated victory now stood frozen, watching their leader crumple to the stone floor. Astrid pulled her sword free with deliberate slowness, letting Eriksson's blood drip from the steel as she turned to face the crowd. Her own wounds were many, gashes across her arms, a deep cut along her temple that painted half her face crimson, but she stood unbowed. The berserker rage that had carried her through the final moments of combat still burned in her eyes like cold fire. "Behold your Jarl," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "The man who murdered my father through treachery and lies, who sent assassins in the night rather than face Thorvald the Bold in honest combat." She nudged Eriksson's lifeless form with her boot. "Where is his courage now?" Magnus stepped forward from among the watching warriors, his weathered face grim but not surprised. The old veteran had seen this moment coming since the day Astrid had returned to reclaim her birthright. He knelt beside his fallen lord, confirming what all could see, then rose to face the blood-soaked woman who had just changed everything. "What would you have of us?" he asked simply. Astrid wiped her blade clean on Eriksson's rich cloak before sheathing it. The gesture was unhurried, almost casual, but every person in the hall understood its significance. The old order was dead. A new power stood before them, forged in exile and tempered by the single-minded pursuit of vengeance. "I would have justice served in full," she replied. "Eriksson's conspirators still breathe. His gold still fills the coffers he stuffed with my family's stolen wealth. His lies still poison the minds of those who believed his version of events." She looked around the hall, meeting the gaze of warrior after warrior. "I would have all debts paid." The great doors burst open as her own forces poured into the hall, the outcasts and dispossessed who had flocked to her banner. the foreign mercenaries who had learned to fear her wrath more than death itself, and most telling of all, nearly half of Ericsson's own men who had switched sides when they learned the truth of Thorvald's murder. They formed a protective circle around their new leader, but Astrid needed no protection now. Her victory was complete. Sven appeared at her shoulder, his massive frame bearing fresh wounds from the courtyard battle. "The keep is ours," he reported quietly. "Ericsson's remaining loyalists have surrendered or fled. His treasury is secured, and his household guards have laid down their weapons." Astrid nodded, though her attention remained fixed on Magnus and the other veteran warriors who had served under her father before Ericsson's treachery divided their loyalties. These men held the key to what came next. They could accept her leadership and help unite the fractured clan, or they could force her to rule through fear alone. "You knew," she said to Magnus. It was not a question. The grizzled warrior's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I suspected. The timing of your father's death, the convenient ambush, Ericsson's swift rise to power. Too many pieces fit too neatly together." He paused, shame flickering across his features, "But I had no proof. And by the time I might have acted, you were already branded outlaw and sent into exile, yet you served him." "I served the clan," Magnus corrected firmly, "as I served your father before him, as I would serve you now if you prove worthy of it." The challenge hung in the air between them. Around the hall, warriors shifted restlessly, hands never far from weapon hilts despite the apparent calm. Everything balanced on this moment, whether Astrid would be seen as a legitimate leader or merely a successful usurper. She stepped closer to Magnus, close enough that he could see the exhaustion beneath her fierce exterior, the toll that years of planning and fighting had taken. But he could also see something else, the same unbreakable will that had made her father legendary among their people. "Then you will help me finish what we started here," she said. Ericsson was merely the first. His allies in neighboring clans still live. The merchants who helped hide his stolen gold still prosper. The skalds who spread lies about my father's death still sing their poisonous songs. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent hall. "Before I am done, they will all understand the price of crossing Thorvald's daughter." Magnus studied her face for a long moment, then slowly knelt. "I serve the rightful heir of this clan," he declared. One by one, the other warriors followed suit, until only Astrid remained standing in the great hall where her father had once held court. The great hall of Jarl Magnus fell silent as Astrid's bloodied axe struck the wooden floor with a resounding thud. Around her lay the bodies of his most trusted warriors, their weapons scattered like broken promises across the rush-covered stones. Magnus himself knelt before her, his once proud beard matted with blood from the gash across his forehead. "You know why I'm here," Astrid said, her voice carrying the weight of winter storms. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her scarred face, each mark a testament to the trials that had forged her into this instrument of vengeance. Magnus raised his trembling head. "Your father, he was my friend once. Before you sold him to Eric Bloodaxe for a handful of silver." She kicked aside a fallen shield, the metal clanging against stone. "Before you watched him burn alive while his enemies counted your payment." The Jarl's remaining men pressed against the walls, too terrified to flee, too horrified to intervene. They had heard the stories spreading like wildfire across the Norse lands, tales of the Raven's daughter who had already claimed the heads of 6 Jarls, each death more creative and terrible than the last. They had seen what remained of Eric Bloodaxe's stronghold, nothing but ash and ravens picking at charred bones. "He was planning rebellion against the High King," Magnus whispered. "I had to choose sides." Astrid's laugh was like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "You chose gold over honor. You chose fear over friendship." She drew her sax, the curved blade gleaming. "Now you'll choose how you die." Magnus struggled to his feet, his hand moving toward the sword at his hip. Astrid watched with predatory patience as he drew the weapon with shaking fingers. She had given each of her father's betrayers the same choice: face her in combat or die like a cowering dog. Most had chosen to fight. None had chosen wisely. "I trained with the best warriors from here to Constantinople," Magnus said, trying to steady his grip. "You're just a girl drunk on legend. Then this should be easy for you." Astrid shifted into a fighting stance, her movements fluid as water, deadly as winter. The scars on her arms told their own stories, lessons learned in blood across a dozen battlefields, teachings from the Valkyrie of the Eastern Steppes, wisdom carved into her flesh by the blade masters of distant lands. Magnus lunged forward with desperate strength, his sword singing through the air where Astrid's head had been a heartbeat before. She spun inside his guard, her sacks opening a line across his ribs that painted the floor crimson. He stumbled back, gasping. "My father trusted you," she said, circling him like a wolf around wounded prey. "He brought you into his confidence, shared his ale, his plans, his hopes for a better kingdom." Magnus swung again, wild and panicked. Astrid caught his wrist, twisted sharply, and the sword clattered away into the shadows. A moment later, her knee found his stomach, doubling him over. "And when Eric's men came for him, you stood beside them." Her voice grew quieter, more terrible. "You watched as they bound him to the post. You counted your silver while the flames rose higher." She grabbed a handful of his hair and forced his head up to meet her gaze. In her eyes, Magnus saw the reflection of his own death. Not quick, not clean, but fitting. "Please," he wheezed. "I have children, grandchildren." "So did my father." Astrid released him, letting him collapse to his knees again. "But I'm not like you, Magnus. I won't make the innocent pay for the guilty." From her belt she drew a small vial filled with dark liquid. Magnus's eyes widened in recognition. Wolfsbane, the poison that brought slow agony and certain death. "This is what you gave my father's guards the night before Eric's raid," she said, uncorking the vial. "The same poison that left them too weak to defend him. I thought it only fitting that you should taste it yourself." Magnus tried to crawl backward, but Astrid's iron grip hauled him upright. With practiced efficiency, she forced the poison down his throat, then stepped back to watch its work begin. "The convulsions will start soon," she told him conversationally. "Then the fever, then the dreams. Such dreams, Magnus. You'll see my father's face in every flame, hear his voice in every scream." She gathered her weapons, cleaning the blood from each blade with methodical care. "Death will come at sunrise if you're fortunate." As she walked toward the great doors, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, Magnus's first spasms began behind her. His remaining men shrank back as she passed, none daring to meet her eyes. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the writhing figure on the floor. "7 down," she said to the shadows. 2 to go. Then she vanished into the night, leaving only death and the echo of her father's approaching justice. The great hall of Bjorn's stronghold crackled with nervous energy as word spread through the settlement like wildfire. The Raven's daughter had come home. Warriors who had sailed across distant seas, who had faced down berserkers and sea monsters, found their hands trembling as they gripped their weapons. They had heard the stories. They knew what she had done to Ragnar's men, to Eric's clan, to every soul who had played a part in her father's murder. Astrid walked through the village streets as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Her armor bore the scars of a dozen battles, and the raven feathers woven into her braids danced in the evening wind. Behind her walked the survivors, the broken, hollow-eyed remnants of those who had wronged her family. They moved like ghosts, their spirits shattered, their minds fractured by the horrors she had shown them. The wooden gates of Bjorn's hall stood open, but no one emerged to greet her. She could see faces peering from windows, could hear the whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned this place. The very air seemed to thicken with dread as she approached the threshold where her father had once been welcomed as a friend and ally. "Bjorn!" Her voice rang out across the courtyard, sharp as the crack of a whip. "Come out and face me. Your cowardice has festered long enough." The great doors groaned open, and there he stood, the man who had orchestrated her father's downfall, who had convinced the others that Magnus posed a threat to their power. Bjorn the Iron Hand, they called him, for the metal gauntlet that replaced the hand he'd lost in his youth. But now that iron hand shook as he beheld what his betrayal had wrought. "Astrid," he said, his voice carrying none of the authority that had once commanded respect. "You've grown into quite the legend." She stepped into the hall, her boots echoing on the stone floor. The hearth fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows Bjorn's men saw shapes that made them grip their sword hilts until their knuckles went white. The skulls of her enemies decorated her belt, and the amber of her eyes held a cold fire that seemed to burn without warmth. "You remember my father's final visit here," she said, circling him like a predator. "You shared ale with him. You clasped his arm in friendship, and then you sent word to the others, told them when he would be traveling home, which route he would take." Bjorn's jaw worked silently for a moment before words finally came. He was gathering too much power. The other Jarls were growing nervous. Someone had to murder him in the night, like a dog. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Someone had to cut down the most honorable man in all the Northlands, because small, frightened creatures like you couldn't bear to see true strength. She drew her sword, the blade her father had given her, now baptized in the blood of his killers. The steel sang as it cleared the scabbard, and several of Bjorn's warriors took involuntary steps backward. "I want you to know," she continued, her voice soft now, intimate, "that before they died, each of your CO conspirators spoke your name. They told me how you planned it, how you convinced them it was necessary. Ragnar wept like a child when I showed him what I could do with hot iron and a patient hand. Eric begged me to kill his own son, rather than let the boy see what his father had become." Bjorn drew his own weapon, the iron hand gripping the hilt with mechanical precision. Around them, his men formed a loose circle, but their formation was shaky, uncertain. They had faced enemy raids and territorial disputes, but this felt different. This felt like standing against the wrath of the gods themselves. "If you've come for single combat," Bjorn said, raising his sword, "then let's finish this." Astrid smiled, and in that expression was a cruelty so pure it made grown men cross themselves. "Oh, Bjorn, you still don't understand. I'm not here to grant you the honor of a warrior's death. I'm here to show you what happens when you take everything from someone who has nothing left to lose." She raised her hand, and the shadows in the hall began to move. The survivors she had brought with her, those broken remnants of her enemies, began to surround Bjorn's warriors. Their eyes were empty, but their hands still remembered how to hold weapons. "You see," Astrid whispered, stepping closer to Bjorn, "death is a mercy, and mercy is something I've forgotten how to give." The last light of day faded from the windows, and in the growing darkness, Bjorn finally understood what the Raven's daughter had truly become. The great hall of Kelferdin stood silent as a tomb, its walls still echoing with the screams that had finally ceased. Astrid walked slowly through the carnage, her boots squelching in the blood-soaked rushes. The men who had murdered her father lay scattered like broken dolls, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Some had begged, others had tried to bargain, none had found mercy. She stopped before the high seat where Jarl Gunnar's corpse slumped forward, his own axe buried deep in his skull. His eyes stared sightlessly at the floor, mouth agape in permanent shock. This man who had orchestrated her father's death, who had stolen their lands and cast her family into exile, now sat as judge over nothing but shadows. The surviving thralls cowered in the corners, pressing themselves against the walls as if they could disappear into the wood itself. Astrid ignored them. They had been slaves to these butchers, nothing more. Her quarrel had never been with the powerless. She moved to the central hearth, where the fire still crackled, feeding it fresh logs until the flames roared high. One by one, she dragged the bodies to the fire, let them burn together as they had plotted together. The smoke rose thick and black through the roof hole, carrying with it the stench of their corruption. When the last corpse had been consigned to the flames, Astrid walked to her father's shield which hung on the wall where Gunnar had displayed it as a trophy. She lifted it reverently, running her fingers over the painted raven that had been Bjorn the Bold's sigil. 17 years she had waited for this moment. 17 years of planning, training, becoming something more terrible than any of them could have imagined. The great doors creaked open behind her. She turned to see Ragnar entering with a dozen of her most trusted warriors, their faces grim with satisfaction. They had dealt with Gunnar's remaining men throughout the settlement, ensuring none escaped to carry word of what had transpired here. "It is done, my lady," Ragnar said, inclining his head. "The last of them died trying to reach their ships." Astrid nodded. "And the people of the settlement? Those who served willingly have been judged. The rest, they kneel outside awaiting your word." She could hear them now, the murmur of frightened voices, children crying, women weeping for husbands who would not return. These were not the architects of her father's doom, merely those who had lived under Gunnar's rule. Her revenge did not extend to them. "Tell them they are free," she said. "Those who wish to serve House Ravenshollow may stay. The rest may go where they will, with enough provisions to see them safely to kinfolk." Ragnar's eyes widened slightly. In the years since she had begun her campaign of vengeance, she had shown little mercy to any who stood against her. But this was different. This had been personal. As her men filed out to see to the survivors, Astrid remained alone with the dead. She pulled her father's ring from her finger, the seal ring of their house that she had worn hidden beneath her glove all these years. She had sworn upon it that she would have justice for his murder, and now that oath was fulfilled. The fire began to die down as the bodies were consumed. Soon there would be nothing left but ash and charred bone. She thought of her father as she had last seen him, riding out with his war band to what he believed was a peaceful negotiation. Gunnar had sent word that he wished to discuss territorial boundaries, to perhaps arrange marriages between their houses. Instead, it had been an ambush, 20 against 5 in a forest clearing where no witnesses could survive. But they had been wrong about witnesses. A terrified 8-year-old girl had followed her father's party, hiding in the underbrush when the trap was sprung. She had watched them cut him down, had heard Gunnar's laughter as he claimed her father's wealth and lands. She had crept home through the darkness to find their hall already burning, her mother and baby brother dead inside. That frightened child was gone now, burned away in the forges of war and vengeance. In her place stood the Raven Queen, as men had come to call her, the woman whose very name made jarls bar their doors and warriors clutch their amulets. She had carved a bloody path across the Northlands, building an army from outcasts and oath-breakers, from men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Now it was finished. The last of her father's killers had paid the price, and House Ravenshollow was avenged. She could feel a strange emptiness where her rage had lived for so long, as if something essential had been carved out of her chest. Tomorrow she would decide what came next. Tonight she would sit vigil with the dead and remember a time when she had been someone else entirely, before the world taught her that mercy was a luxury only the strong could afford.